Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first of 3 webinars that the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine is hosting this week to mark Science Week 2022. For those that don't know me, my name is Carl Walsh. I'm the head of the research division here in the department, and I'm moderating the webinars this week. These webinars are running over the course of Science Week, which officially began yesterday and runs until next Sunday. And Science Week really aims to engage the public in general on science and to discuss and explore the possibilities that science offers. And this year it has the specific theme of infinite possibilities. Science and research, of course, are critical to the sustainable development of the agri-food and forest and bioeconomy sector. And in terms of publicly funded research, this sector is actually the 3rd largest recipient of finance, accounting for 11% of overall government expenditure on research. And that's primarily distributed through ourselves in the department, along with our state agencies, Teagasc and the Marine Institute. So we're bringing you the 3 webinars this week on just a small selection of projects that we've been funding in recent times. This is scientific research that's really at the cutting edge of key societal, sectoral and environmental challenges. And those include, for example, climate change, climate adaptation, soil health, biodiversity enhancement, water quality improvement, and human health and nutrition. The projects that we've selected span the entire range of research that's needed to develop a sustainable food system as set out in the 10-year strategy Food Vision 2030, in that they cover agriculture, environment, and human health. So the first of the webinars today is on a project called SMARTSWARD, and this was funded from our 2017 call for proposals. The project is led by Professor Tommy Boland in UCD, and Tommy will be presenting here today along with his colleagues, Professor Helen Sheridan and a PhD student working on the project, Michelle Kearns. This project received just over €1 million in funding from the department, as well as co-funding of over €200,000 from our colleagues in the Department of Agriculture and Environment Northern Ireland. For the Northern Irish partners on the project, the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute and DIT are also involved. So I think the team are going to present their findings from the research, where essentially they've been comparing multi-species swards that include grasses, legumes and forage herbs to perennial ryegrass monocultures and perennial ryegrass and white clover swards. And they've been doing these comparisons in terms of their production potential, impacts on product quantity and quality, fertiliser use and fertiliser inputs, and then measuring the associated methane and nitrogen emissions. So for the webinar today, the presenters are going to speak to you now for about the next half an hour, and then we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. So to kick things off, I'm going to hand over to Helen. Helen, you're very welcome. I hope you're set to go there. And John, my colleague here in the division, is going to manage your slideshow. So Helen, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Carol. Okay, just waiting for the slides. Great, thanks very much. Okay, good morning, everybody, and many thanks for the opportunity to speak here this morning about our SMARTSWARD research. So we're looking, as Carl said, at multi-species swards. This morning, myself, Tommy and Michelle are presenting, but there are a large number of other people directly involved in the project, and I'd like to acknowledge their input at this stage in the presentation as well. The next slide, please, John. Okay, so when we talk about multi-species swards, our research on this started about a decade ago now with the then department-funded Smart Grass project. And I guess what we were looking at, and Karen mentioned, mixtures of swards that comprised grasses, legumes and forage herbs. And what we're selecting for there are species that have complementary traits in terms of growth habits, rooting depths, etc. So when I refer to multi-species swards, while there's no definition of what a multi-species sward is. What I'm particularly referring to, and what we'll be referring to throughout the presentation, are swards comprised of perennial ryegrass, timothy as grasses, red and white clover as legumes, and then chicory and plantain as the forage herbs included within them. The next slide there, John, please. So in terms of where we were coming from with this project, we were building on what we had found within the SMARTSWARD project, and within that we had found evidence of enhanced sward performance. So under reduced nitrogen input requirements, we were seeing increased dry matter yields in terms of herbage from plots. We saw improved animal performance and health, where lambs reared on multi-species swards were finishing about 2 weeks earlier than their counterparts on perennial ryegrass swards, and also there was a reduced need for anthelmintics with them. We also saw evidence of enhanced biodiversity and vertebrate diversity and associated soil functions such as water infiltration rates. And then, of course, the potential for reduced greenhouse gas emissions based on the reduced nitrogen input levels and also the faster finishing times of the animals. We also saw that once we make the swards once we cut the swards for silage under good weather conditions, they have the potential to make really good quality silage. So it was building again on that backdrop, I guess, that the SMARTSWARD project came about. And what we wanted to see was how would these swards perform under beef grazing, and hence we moved on to the SMARTSWARD project. John, next slide, please. So building on that, we had decided at UCD, we had a section of land which we wanted to look at the long-term implications of how we would manage it on a range of different parameters relating to sustainability. And I guess what we had realized was particularly important was time in all of this. Many of the research projects, I guess, we get 2 or 3 years fieldwork out of them, and then they finish up. But this section of land is going to be committed in the long term to assessing various parameters, including biodiversity, pasture performance and resilience, food quality, profitability of systems, etc. So the long-term grazing platform is based at UCD Lyons Farm, and it's a participant site in the Global Farm Platform, which is a network of international sites which focus on the sustainability of ruminant production systems. Next slide, please, John. The site itself was established in 2019, and it's comprised of 3 farmlets, each of which are 8 hectares in size. So the first one is a perennial ryegrass sward type, which is monoculture of ryegrass, and that receives 205 kg of nitrogen per hectare per year. We then have perennial ryegrass and white clover, which is receiving 90 kg per hectare per year, and then a multi-species sward comprised of the species I mentioned earlier, and that as well is receiving 90 kg per hectare per year. Each of these farmlets are stocked at 2.5 livestock units per hectare, with male animals coming from the dairy herd. We had decided on, I suppose, having this long-term platform in place, but then the opportunity came to apply for Department of Agriculture funding, and it was under that we got the funding for the SMARTSWARD project, which is the first funded project on the long-term grazing platform. John, the next slide, please. So as Carol mentioned, this project was funded, it was led by UCD together with our collaborators in these various institutions, and funded under the 2017 call of the Department of Agriculture. Next slide, please, John. So in terms of what I'll present for the remainder of the presentation, I'm focusing very much on pasture performance and the resilience, I guess, of those pastures over the time period of this project. Next slide, please, John. So when we looked at the dry matter herbage production from the 3 sward types over 2020 and 2021, they were sown in 2019, we found that we get a significant increase in yield under the multi-species swards when compared to the other two. So we're getting an increase of about 2.5 tonnes more herbage dry matter produced, even though these swards are only receiving about 40% of the fertiliser nitrogen being applied to the perennial ryegrass monocultures. Next slide, please, John. When we look at the contribution of the individual species that were sown into the paddocks, I guess one of the big concerns that people seem to have about multi-species swards is that there's no safe post-emergence herbicide that can be applied to them. So people are often concerned about the potential for weed encroachment over time. So this graph here is just showing the contribution of the different groups of species or functional groups of species to the herbage dry matter over time. And you can see that the navy area on each of the bars indicates the level of weed contribution or unsown species contribution to overall herbage dry matter within each of the 3 sward types. And there was no difference over the course of the work that was being done. Next slide, please, John. Again, here we're looking at what kind of species, weed species or unsown species would be associated with the different sward types. So here the red indicates the ryegrass monocultures, the yellow indicates the ryegrass and white clover swards, and the green indicates the multi-species swards. And the way you interpret this graph is proximity means a closer association with. And you can see from it that none of the weed species or unsown species appear to be closely associated with our multi-species swards. So despite the fact that we can't apply any post-emergence herbicides to them, at this stage from this research, we haven't seen any significant problems with weed encroachment within the swards. Next slide, please, John. In terms of what's happening to the sown species over time, again, I guess a challenge for us has been keeping the herb component within the swards. Species like chicory tend to be relatively short-lived perennial species anyhow. And in terms of trying to manage our swards to promote persistence of the herb component, we were grazing the multi-species swards to a post-grazing sward height of 6 centimetres versus 4 centimetres in the other 2 sward types. But despite this, you can still see that from 2020 to 2021, we're still seeing a reduction in the herb contribution to the overall dry matter of the multi-species swards. So despite managing to try and promote persistence of the herb component, we still see this decrease. And this is an issue that we have to deal with. And has led to us working, I suppose, on oversowing herbs into the swards this year following silage cutting. In addition to the large-scale paddock scale experiments that were going on, we also wanted to learn a little bit more about how best to manage the multi-species swards, because we don't have the kind of background knowledge of management associated with these swards that you would have with ryegrass swards. So we're trying to learn this. Again, we had the 3 sward types that we established in a plot experiment, and here we're looking at ryegrass at 250 kgN per hectare per year, and the other 2 sward types, the ryegrass and white clover and the multi-species, both receiving 90 kgN. What we did here was look at the 3 sward types under differing harvest rotation lengths, so a 21-day versus 28-day rotation, and then a 4 centimetre versus 6 centimetre post-harvest sward height. So we're interested in seeing how those kind of management factors would influence the yield from the swards, but also the persistence of the individual species over time. Next slide there, please, John. So what we see from that work is that the yields were similar across the 3 sward types. Again, despite the fact that the ryegrass and white clover and the multi-species swards were only receiving, again, about less than 40% of the nitrogen being applied to the perennial ryegrass swards, the yields were similar. We didn't see an impact of post-cutting sward height, so the 4 centimetres versus 6 centimetres didn't seem to matter in terms of yield, but the 28-day rotation certainly had a significant impact on the multi-species swards. So while it didn't impact on the other sward types in terms of dry matter herbage production, we were seeing that we had a significant response in the multi-species swards when they were managed under a 28-day rotation. Next slide, please, John. And again, looking at the weed species associated with the different treatments here, again, we see a similar trend to that noted at paddock scale, where we're not getting any close association between individual unsown species and the multi-species swards. Next slide there, John, please. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Tommy now.
Thanks very much, Helen. And so where I'm going to pick up the story, folks, is when we start to look at animal performance on our multi-species swards. And just to recap, I suppose, the importance of animal agriculture in Ireland, particularly as it relates to the land use, with the predominant land use in Ireland being under livestock grazing systems. And as a result of this and a few other reasons that we don't have time to go into this morning, the agri-food sector is quite a large contributor to total national greenhouse gas emissions. And within this greenhouse gas emissions portfolio from agriculture, we see methane emissions from ruminant animals and from ruminant digestion being the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for almost 65% of all greenhouse gas emissions arising from agriculture. Nitrous oxide, which arises from fertiliser applications and from animal excreta being applied to soil, also has a large role to play, looking at about 30% of total emissions. And our emissions are on an increasing trajectory since 1990. In addition, post-quota removal in 2015, we have seen an increase in dairy cows with a 45% increase in cow numbers. And in fact, that has supported a 60% increase in milk production. So we're getting a larger increase in milk output than we are in cow numbers. And for that reason, we're also seeing more of our beef animals, or animals entering the beef herd, originating in the dairy herd. And we'll see in a moment why that's important in the context of this study. And as we're all aware now that agriculture has an emissions target of 25% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. So obviously, with nitrous oxide and methane being the largest contributing gases to our agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, these are important targets for reduction. So John, if you could move to the next slide there, please. So Helen has used this graphic already this morning, and I've just highlighted the areas which I'm going to focus on in my presentation for the next few minutes. So we're going to look at the performance. If you just go back there, John, for 1 second. We're going to look at the performance of the grazing animals. We're going to look at the profitability within our systems, which is, it's always important to maintain the economic sustainability aspect of our discussions. We're going to look at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprinting of the products produced. And again, this is work that's been repeated over a long-term time horizon. So once, sorry, John, if you can go on then to the questions which we're trying to answer with this animal work. So first and foremost, for various reasons, including economic, environmental, and availability of inputs, we've asked the question of our systems: can we reduce inputs into these systems? In light of these reduced inputs, can we maintain performance, or is it possible to improve performance? From that maintenance or improved performance from a reduction in inputs, can we reduce the environmental impact of our production systems? And if so, is it possible to maintain our profitability or even increase profitability under such a scenario? So John, we move on now to look at the actual treatments we're using. And again, Helen has outlined the individual sward treatments in detail. We have our perennial ryegrass system. I'll just draw your attention to the fact that perennial ryegrass for the remainder of my presentation is presented in red, and the perennial ryegrass system received 205 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Our perennial ryegrass white clover in blue received 90 kilograms, and our multi-species swards containing ryegrass, timothy, red and white clover, plantain and chicory, highlighted in green, received 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Okay, next slide, please, John. So all my results slides will have the same layout pretty much. We will have the 3 treatments presented in their respective colours, and then I will also have a summary box appearing at the end of the slide, which will kind of summarise the results. So again, Helen has already displayed this data, so we're just looking at the herbage production under the 3 different sward types. And John, if you just bring through the next aspect of this slide. We saw in the grazing study over the 2 years that the multi-species swards produced an extra 2.5 tonne of forage dry matter per hectare compared to perennial ryegrass swards, despite receiving 150 kilograms less nitrogen per hectare. Now, it's very important to understand that for these, if we just go back for a second, John, it's very important to understand that for these plants to actually grow, for the legumes and the herbs and the grass to grow, nitrogen is required in the system. So with the multi-species sward in particular, we're seeing a high level of nitrogen fixation coming from the red clover to support the plant growth. Next slide, please, John. Because it's a beef production system, it's obviously important to understand the impact on the performance of the animals. So we have, I suppose, categorized the animal performance in terms of live weight and by proxy live weight gain. So we looked at 4 different time points. Obviously, the starting weight was similar for all animals, or identical for all animals, because we could design the experiment that they would all have the same starting weight. At the end of their first summer, we recorded very modest, so in a scientific term, we would say there were no differences in the live weights of the animals after the first summer of grass. When those animals were housed, the animals which had grazed perennial ryegrass in the summertime were fed perennial ryegrass silage during the winter, and the same applied for the white clover animals. They received white clover silage during the winter, and the multi-species animals received multi-species silage during the winter. So what we actually saw for those calves in their first winter indoors, the calves receiving the multi-species silage grew at an accelerated rate compared to the calves receiving the perennial ryegrass silage. And that came as somewhat of a surprise to us, because we didn't really know how these animals are going to perform on silage indoors. At the end of the second grazing season, so when they were housed for their second winter, the cattle grazing either the perennial ryegrass, white clover, or the multi-species swards were significantly heavier than the cattle grazing the perennial ryegrass sward. All animals had a target slaughter weight, and that's a key component of a dairy calf to beef system. So we brought all animals to the same slaughter weight prior to them actually being slaughtered and processed. Next slide, please, John. Because we took all cattle to the same live weight at slaughter, they all produced the same level of carcass. So about 314, 313 kilos of carcass. They all had the same kill out percentage. But when we look at the number of days required for these animals to reach that target slaughter weight, it was about 5 weeks shorter for the cattle grazing the multi-species sward compared to the perennial ryegrass. So compared to the perennial ryegrass, animals grazing ryegrass plus white clover, which was almost the same as multi-species swards, or the multi-species sward, reached slaughter weight at a younger age. And if we move on now to look at what impact that actually has on the carbon footprint per kilogram of beef live weight, and have a slide for per kilogram of beef carcass, but due to time restrictions I can't show it. It's essentially the exact same response. We see that animals fed either the perennial ryegrass white clover treatment from turnout at 15 weeks of age until slaughter, or the multi-species sward treatment, produced a 15% lower carbon footprint compared to the animals offered the perennial ryegrass sward. And if we compare these carbon footprint figures to some of the Teagasc National Farm Survey data for the top one-third of cattle or beef produced, or the origin green data, we see on average the cattle in this experiment were about 50% lower in terms of their carbon footprint. But I would make the point, it's always we need to be very cautious in looking at average figures at a national level. There are such, I suppose, ingrained system differences. If we move on, John, to the next slide. And obviously one of the questions we'd set ourselves at the start was to understand the impact of these alterations in management system on gross margin and net margin per hectare. So the gross margin is presented here in the solid columns, the net margin is presented in the hatched columns. So what we saw was profitability was increased on the multi-species and the perennial ryegrass plus white clover systems compared to our perennial ryegrass monoculture systems. We saw as much as a 68% increase in net margin, and this was largely driven by reduced fertiliser nitrogen inputs and the reduced period to slaughter, which meant we had reduced concentrate input going into those systems. And this has taken account of a more frequent reseeding rate required with the multi-species swards, or a rejuvenation required with the multi-species swards, as Helen referenced towards the end of our presentation. Next slide, please, John. So if we go back and reflect on the questions and what answers we found, the question, can we reduce inputs? Well, yes, fertilizer, nitrogen and concentrate inputs were reduced. I might just expand very briefly on the concentrates for a moment. All animals are housed at the end of the second grazing season on the same date. We bring all animals to the same level of carcass, finish and live weight. To do that, we feed those animals a 50-50 forage to concentrate diet in the shed. So half their diet comes from the silage from the respective systems, and half the diet comes from concentrates. The fact, excuse me, we're reducing their finishing period meant we reduced the level of concentrate feeding required on the ryegrass, white clover, and the multi-species systems. So did these reduction in fertilizer and concentrate inputs come at a production cost? No, they didn't. Performance of the swards and the animals were both improved. So from lower fertilizer and nitrogen inputs, we grew more herbage on the multi-species sward, and the animals grew at a faster rate. So did this result in a reduction in environmental impact? Well, yes, the carbon footprint per kilogram of animal live weight and per kilogram of carcass or beef produced was reduced by 15%. This is based on the fact there were lower nitrous oxide emissions in the system because we were using less fertilizer nitrogen, and there were lower methane emissions in the system overall because the animals had a shorter lifetime to slaughter. At the moment, we're currently calculating treatment-specific emissions factors for both nitrous oxide and methane from the soils and from the animals enrolled in the study. And then finally, from the farmer perspective, it's always important to bear in mind the economic impact of any changes you make at farm level. So we saw significant increases in net profit when we moved from a multi-species or a ryegrass white clover system, and they were being driven by reduced inputs. We had the same level of output across all systems, so the treatment differences in profitability were driven by reduced inputs. Next slide, please, John. And that's where I'll leave you now, everybody, and I'll pass over to Michelle to look at meat quality. Thank you.
Thanks, Tommy. And just before Michelle kicks off, just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, there's a question box there that you can type your questions into, and we'll come to those at the end of the presentations shortly. So Michelle, off you go.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks, Tommy. So following on from Helen and Tommy's work on the swards and the animal performance, my research is concerned with looking at how multi-species pasture can influence food quality, and in particular, I will be looking at meat quality. So we just move to the next slide, John, please. So firstly, why are we interested in looking at meat quality in relation to multi-species pasture? So as Helen and Tommy have mentioned and outlined, there's a range of different benefits associated with utilising multi-species pasture in terms of improved sward performance and animal performance. And all this research contributes towards the common goal of the Food Vision 2030 strategy, which is to become a global leader in sustainable food production systems. However, the goal of any food production system is that to produce a food that is of high quality and consumption for the consumer. So it's important that we look at how meat quality can be influenced when animals graze these multi-species pastures to see if there's any positive or improved response for the meat quality. So just a bit of background about the diet of the animal and how this might influence the meat quality. So what the animal eats, and in particular with regards to pasture grazing, has a major influence on the overall nutritional composition and therefore the quality of the meat. So pasture grazing can influence not only the fat content of the meat, but also the vitamin content. And this in turn then has an effect on the overall quality of the product. So it can affect not only the flavour, but the colour and the texture of the meat, which then has an overall impact on the sensory appeal of the product. This then also affects how long the product can remain on the shelf in terms of its rancidity potential. So John, if you just move to the next slide, please. So the first aspect that we wanted to look at was the nutritional composition of the meat. So firstly, we looked at the fat content of the meat from the animals grazing the different pasture treatments. And fat content is particularly important not only from a nutritional perspective, but also from a quality perspective. So consumers are aware that from a nutritional standpoint, you should try to decrease the amount of saturated fatty acids in your diet and increase more beneficial unsaturated fatty acids. So we were particularly interested in looking at polyunsaturated fatty acids, and these are a particular type of long chain fat that has associated health benefits. So with regards to that, we also wanted to look at omega-3 fatty acids as well, and these are a particular type of unsaturated fatty acid with associated health benefits. And what we found from this study was that proportions of polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids were higher in the meat from multi-species animals when compared to the meat from perennial ryegrass animals. And this is not only seen as beneficial from a nutritional standpoint, but it also could have an effect on the overall quality of the meat, which I will touch on later. So John, would you mind moving to the next slide, please? So then we also wanted to look at the vitamin content of the meat. So there's a range of different vitamins present in the meat, but we were particularly interested in vitamin E. Vitamin E within the meat acts as an antioxidant. So what an antioxidant does is it helps preserve the meat when it's on the shelf. So it extends the shelf life and kind of promotes stability within the lipids. So what we found was that the meat from perennial ryegrass grazed animals had a significantly higher concentration of vitamin E when compared to the meat from multi-species sward animals. And this is interesting in this context because the lower vitamin E content of the meat from the multi-species sward animals, combined with the difference in the fat content, could affect the overall shelf life stability of the meat. So going forward, we wanted to test out a variety of different quality parameters to see if it did have an impact. So John, you can move to the next slide, please. So first of all, we wanted to look at meat tenderness. So from a consumer perspective, the tenderness of the meat is a very important quality parameter. So consumers tend to prefer meat that is tender, easy to bite through, kind of melt in the mouth. And so what we found when we looked at this was that there was no difference observed between the treatments. So there was no negative or positive impact from grazing animals on multi-species swards in terms of tenderness. So John, if you go to the next slide, please. So then following on from the data we collected on the nutritional composition, we wanted to assess the shelf life stability of the meat because there was a difference in the fat content and the vitamin content of the meat from the multi-species sward animals. So we decided to carry out a shelf life stability study. So this was over a 2-week period, and this is really stretching out the limit of meat on a shelf. So we looked at uncooked meat and cooked meat. So firstly, for the uncooked meat, we found that there was a difference over time with regards to the oxidation in the meat. However, this was expected. You wouldn't expect a meat on day 14 to have the same level of stability as meat from day 0. So this is expected. However, we did not see an overall treatment effect. So as the days progressed during storage, there was no effect of the different pasture treatments on the overall stability of the meat, which was a positive outcome considering that the meat from the multi-species sward animals did have a different fat content and vitamin content. So John, if you move to the next slide, please. So then we looked at cooked meat as well. So typically sometimes consumers might cook a meat and then leave it in their fridge for 1 to 2 days. So we also wanted to assess how this lasted in terms of its shelf life. So again, we found a similar trend with regards to time. So the meat did oxidize over time, which is again what we expected, irregardless of treatment. But interestingly here, if you just bring in the animation, John, please, there was a treatment effect on day 1 and 2 of storage. So you can see that the meat from perennial ryegrass, white clover and multi-species sward animals did have a slightly higher level of lipid oxidation on day 1 and 2 of storage. However, this difference is only extremely slight, and this may not be discernible to consumers or have an overall negative impact on the overall quality of the meat. So John, if you go to the next slide, please. So then we wanted to look at meat colour as well in relation to the quality. And arguably this is one of the most important parameters when considering the quality of the meat, because it's the first parameter that consumers kind of come into contact with when they pick up meat on a shelf. So typically we associate a fresh meat and beef, for example, with being a bright red in colour. So in this particular instance, we looked at hue, which is the pigment of the meat. So this is how red the meat is. And what we found was that, again, similar to the shelf life stability, the colour did change over time over the 14 days of storage. And again, this was expected, as you wouldn't expect a meat on day 14 to have the same colour as meat on day 0. However, we did see that the meat from multi-species sward animals did have a higher hue or more of a red colour on day 14 of storage. So John, if you go to the next slide, please. So then to date, or on the previous slides, all that work or data that was collected was done from a lab-based analysis techniques. So we wanted to kind of apply all the data that we gathered in a more real-world setting. So we decided to carry out a sensory analysis study and give the meat a trained panel to see what they thought and whether we could corroborate our lab-based results. So we carried out a sensory analysis test using a 9-person trained panel, and this was in conjunction with our colleagues in Chagas in Ashtown. So the trained panel were given the task of rating 12 different sensory attributes using a scale, with 0 being low or none and 10 being extreme or intense. And the sensory attributes varied from different flavour attributes such as livery, beef flavour, off flavour, to different quality attributes such as tenderness, juiciness and chewiness. And John, if you just bring in the animation, please. So what we found was in the trained panel, they found no significant difference for any of the treatments for any of the sensory attributes. So this kind of corroborates the lab-based research that we collected, so in terms of the tenderness and the colour, etc. However, there was a trend for the multi-species sward beef to be slightly more juicy, sour and metallic in taste. However, this was just a trend and it wasn't significantly different. So we're conducting analysis right now to kind of learn a bit more about this. So John, if you go on to the next slide, please. So just to kind of sum up and in conclusion, overall grazing animals on multi-species pastures did improve the overall fat content of the meat. And this could be seen as beneficial, as it did improve beneficial unsaturated fatty acids in the meat profile. And again, the overall meat quality was not compromised when grazing animals on the multi-species sward pastures. And this is kind of the key take-home message, that the overall quality of the meat is not compromised, or the meat quality standards can be upheld when utilising these multi-species pastures. So again, we're currently assessing the flavour profile of the meat, and we're going to combine this data with the sensory analysis data to get more complete profile of the overall flavour with respect to the meat. And I think the key take-home message is that uptake of multi-species pastures by meat producers is key going forward to ensure that the research collected across these slides is implemented in a farm setting. So it's like, thank you.
Thanks, John. Just to reflect, I suppose, on this slide for a moment, where we had identified key components of sustainability associated with ruminant production systems, and SMARTSWARD has allowed us to focus on each of these elements indicated here in green that you've just heard about this morning. In addition, other research projects also funded through the department, such as the FASTN project and also the recently started Multi for More project, will allow us to focus on additional elements of those sustainability challenges or components. If you just want to bring in that animation, John, please. Yeah, so those ones are highlighted here in yellow. In saying that, you know, the time is really significant with this kind of work. It has the UCD long-term grazing platform is a globally unique site. Each of the sward types, and we didn't, or each of the paddocks rather, we didn't talk about it here this morning, are hydrologically isolated. So there is no other site which has that level of hydrological isolation and that's across such a wide area and replicated so much. So we have a unique opportunity here to look at these components of sustainability in an integrated way, but it does need to be done over the longer term so that we get the true picture of how they actually interact together and their influence on our systems. So that's where I leave that. A final word is just to our students. Doing a PhD can be challenging at the best of times. Doing a PhD in COVID times was unique and particularly challenging. And I'd just like to acknowledge that and thank our students for their resilience, their determination, and their dedication to doing excellent research throughout this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks to the team. And that's a really good point, I think, to finish the presentations on. I mean, certainly from our perspective in the department, I mean, this is a really, really nice example of a scientific project that, you know, has multidisciplinary research. You saw a lot of that throughout the presentations there. It's also a good example of taking a food systems approach that's at the forefront of our minds these days since Food Vision was published, and that essentially means that we design research projects that consider all aspects from agriculture and agronomy to environmental and climate aspects right through to food and nutrition aspects. So really well done. We have a few questions there. I know we're kind of pushing up against our timeline, but I think if people are happy to stay on for a few minutes, we'll run through the questions. So the first one is from Sean Douglas, and the question is, in terms of water quality, is multi-species better than monocultures at absorbing nutrients or reducing runoff? So I don't know, is that for you, Helen or Tommy?
Well, I suppose I'll start it anyhow, and Tommy, you can come in. As I mentioned, we do have the hydrological isolation in place on the platform, which will allow us to monitor the water quality coming off each of the sward types to see, to answer that question exactly. However, that process is, I suppose, in the early stages. So we need more time to be able to answer the question that's been asked, but we're in the process of doing it.
And
okay,
just maybe to add briefly to that, Carol, you could certainly construct a hypothesis as to why multi-species swards may potentially have a positive impact in that regard, but we can't say anything more definitive until we actually collect that data.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But I mean, the significant reduction in chemical fertilizer use overall in the system would have positive aspects anyway from a water quality point of view. So another question then is, was there any evidence of selective grazing? I think this is a feature that we hear about quite frequently with these swards, and how might that affect sward composition over time?
I'm not sure that you call it selective grazing, but they do. The animals certainly like the herb component and the legume component. We are seeing that decrease in herbs over time, regardless of whether we graze to 6 centimeters or not. I mean, you can see it over time, it's decreasing. So I do think that regardless of how we manage them, we're probably going to have to rejuvenate them in terms of the herb component after kind of 3 years or so. So this year, after we cut silage, we didn't apply any slurry to half of the area under multi-species, so that's 4 hectares. We cut that back as well as we could, and then oversowed or stitched in just the herb component again. So we're monitoring that. Initial indications are very positive that the herbs are coming back into it, and with minimal disturbance to the sward.
Okay, thanks, Helen. a colleague in our climate unit has a question here as to whether you've looked at the resilience of the species under changing climate conditions. And I suppose this is with the perspective of adapting to climate change and the role of these swards in that context.
Yeah, it's not something we've looked at, Carl, yet. I think the large-scale animal studies initially were to capture the impact on animal performance, building on the results from SMARTSWARD and the benefits of sward performance as well. And because it was a grazing study, you know, there were obviously we had the one climate we could test it under. It certainly is something we'd be looking in the future at, looking in indoor conditions where we can actually have climate controlled growth chambers to see how the individual species and the mixtures respond under different conditions.
Yeah. But I guess anecdotally, we know that deeper rooting plants generally are more tolerant to drought conditions, so they may have some positive advantages there. But that's to be tested further under laboratory conditions. Is that it? We have
seen we had a dry spell. I won't use the word drought. We had dry periods during this year and in 2020 as well, I think. And what we had noticed in that time period, that the multi-species swards were more resilient under those drought conditions, that their growth rates maintained at a higher level for longer, but eventually the system will run out of water regardless of what mixture you have there. Sure.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. Moving to the food end of things, a question here from Seamus Fagan is whether the improved fat content might be due to less time being fed concentrate feed.
Yeah, so when we found the difference in the fatty acid profile, we thought that could be a reason. So I didn't include it in these slides, but we actually looked at the proximate composition, so the overall fat content in the meat, and they didn't differ between the pasture treatments. So overall, there was no significant difference in the overall fat content. Additionally, tissue turnover, so in relation to fatty acids and vitamin contents, it's kind of the slowest tissue turnover with respect to meat. So it would take quite a long period of time to see the difference of concentrates in the meat.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Michelle. But I mean, the results in themselves around the higher concentrations of omega-3s and polyunsaturated fatty acids is really impressive. And those are the very things that the dietitians tell us we need to be consuming more of. So to get an effect like that from the swards is really another strong attribute of the swards. Just a quick question for myself on that one. Like, would you expect those same findings to come through in milk?
Yes, so my colleague in TUT is actually analysing the milk quality as well, and you would expect milk, you would actually see more of a difference, I think, a lot quicker than with respect to the meat. So you would see a similar turnover with respect to the milk as well.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. A very quick question from Sean Finan then is whether the swards received any slurry.
Last year they received the slurry produced by the animals when they were housed over the winter period. So that was returned to the swards. And I suppose we didn't really know how they were going to react to slurry application, but there's been no issue with that. So it was the swards that were being cut for silage that we applied slurry to.
Okay, thanks, Helen. And then another question here is around internal parasite infections and overall anthelmintic use. So this is another strong positive feature of multi-species swards. Tommy, do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Carl. So in our previous work with sheep, we saw a 50% reduction in anthelmintic usage in our sheep systems. That's where we had ewes and lambs grazing together. Obviously, in a sheep type of system, the ewe acts as an inoculant of the pasture. In this particular study, we have calves coming in from the dairy herd, so there are no mature cattle. All these swards were reseeded in 2018, 2019. There was no mature cattle on the sward, so essentially there's been no inoculation of that pasture with parasites because we're using new animals all the time. At this point, we haven't seen any differences in parasite loads, but across all treatments, parasite loads have been extremely low because we essentially went into clean pasture with calves and it hasn't been infected or inoculated with parasites. But there's lots of data internationally and our own sheep work say that you do see reduced parasite burdens and requirement for dose multi-species swards.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Tommy. Then there's a kind of two questions around establishment. I might put the two together. So the question is, how essentially were they established? What was it, ploughing with or without glyphosate? How would they establish in the absence of using glyphosate? And do you think that there would be an annual requirement for reseeding or oversowing?
Okay, well maybe I'll start on that one. The answer in our case, we use glyphosate. We sprayed them off, the existing swards off. I mentioned during the presentation we don't have a post-emergence herbicide that's suitable for use on multi-species swards. So in my mind, successful establishment is very dependent on controlling weeds before you put any seed in the ground, that you have to take care of existing weed issues before that happens. I mean, in the absence of glyphosate, I don't know, I mean, we're certainly going to have a challenge establishing, I guess, across all sward types if we have to work in the absence of it. So, I mean, we used it and certainly it's going to be, you know, getting that existing weed burden under control is key to successful establishment. In terms of the need for oversowing, we established in 2019. It's only this summer, so 2022, that we've gone in to do some oversowing with herbs. So we've gotten 3 years out of the swards without oversowing. So I'd be expecting that we could get 3 to 4 years out of the herb component. And that's not to say that all the herb had gone in them. It's just I could see a decrease in the herb composition of the swards and the herb component of the swards. So rather than letting the whole platform get to 0 herb content, we went in to address that decrease across half of the area of the multi-species first, with a view that we'll oversow the other half next summer.
Okay, thanks, Helen. And I suppose the key point there is that it's getting the weeds under control before establishment, because your early slides showed that there wasn't a difference actually in the emergence of weeds across the 3 systems post-establishment. So I think that's an important finding, because there is probably some perception out there that the weed control is a significant issue on these, and that's not what came through in your research anyway.
Well, certainly, yeah, to date it hasn't appeared so, but the weed burden in advance controlling that is certainly key.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We'll finish up now in a couple of minutes, but I just have a few more questions. A lot of interest here. So Dave McGilloway is asking, both the grass clover sward and the multi-species had relatively high inputs of chemical nitrogen. Why were those set so high?
So the 90 kgN per hectare per year that we were putting on those, I guess that was based on our learnings from SMARTSWARD, where we had found that when we were putting about 90 kg of N onto those sward types at plot level, we were actually exceeding the dry matter production of the ryegrass, receiving 250 kgN in that instance. So that's where we pitched it at. I guess now where we're thinking we will look at potentially reducing that N input into the future. So we're considering, you know, having that N input onto the sward types. Our legume content has stayed up well in the, you know, it's really high. It has remained very good so far throughout those swards. So we think we can reduce N further, so that would be a next step for us.
Yeah, Tommy?
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, Carol, you know, in these dairy calf to beef systems, their successful running is really dependent on the production of an adequate quantity of high quality first cut silage. given the fact that your grazing demand is quite low early in the season. So while overall those treatments were getting 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, you know, there was additional nitrogen going on to the swards which were identified for closing for first cut silage, and then the actual grazing swards which weren't being closed for first cut silage were receiving approximately 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And again, that's kind of given us some confidence to look at reducing that fertiliser nitrogen application rate even further. The other thing about the nitrogen in the multi-species and the white clover systems, we did not apply nitrogen after late April, early May. So from that point on, the nitrogen in the system was coming from the legume.
Okay, good. Thanks, Tommy. I'll just take one final question. It's from our colleague Jerome Walsh, and he's basically asking whether there's any research or recommendations on multi-species mixtures for wetter grassland conditions, because these are areas where clover is more difficult to establish or on lower pH soils. Is this another case of we're looking into it?
I'm afraid so. I mean, there's no definition of what a multi-species sward is. What we are working on is what we found to work best under the conditions that we have in Lyons, and I guess they're working well across a range of other farms as well at this stage. But yeah, I mean, certainly with wetter soils, it's likely that it will change in composition significantly, although, you know, the legume content is what drives the nitrogen reduction. So that's key to the success of the swards. So you really need to be able to get the legume content in there.
Yeah.
And just on the legume, fine. Just on the legume point, Carl, that's so pH dependent. So if you have low soil, you will have a low or no legume content in your sward. You need to get your soil pH up around that 6.5 mark to get a successful legume establishment and successful nitrogen fixation by those legumes.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, thanks, Tommy, thanks, Helen and Michelle. I mean, like, obviously, there's a good few questions there around aspects that need some further research, but I think from your slides, it's clear that there are already really significant positive aspects to multi-species swards that are, you know, good grounds for which to encourage their use, and that's why the department introduced a support scheme for their establishment. This year, there was funding there to target 8,000 hectares of multi-species swards establishment, and I think we'll see more and more interest in this area. And actually, just so that everybody knows, the aspects of the research that need further investigation, well, earlier this year we awarded funding to a very large project called Multi for More. So there's 1.2 billion in funding there for that project, being led by John Finn in Teagasc Johnstown Castle, but the team here in UCD are involved in it as well, plus researchers in Trinity and AFBI Northern Ireland. So I think a lot of those aspects that we touched on today will come through in that project as well. So look, I just want to finish up the webinar by thanking Tommy, Helen and Michelle for giving us their time today, and for, as Helen said, to all the other students and technicians and everybody that worked on the project during a particularly difficult period in COVID. I really want to thank you for the excellent science that you've conducted. It's important to highlight that in this Science Week. Just for people watching, just to remind you that we have 2 more webinars this week. Tomorrow's webinar will be moving over to the topic of climate change and greenhouse gas mitigation. That's on at 9:30 as well. You can still register for that. If you go onto our website or any of our social media accounts on Twitter and LinkedIn, you'll see the registration link there. And also just to give a plug for our new dashboard, which we've launched today. This provides a lot of information and statistics on the research that we're funding, and crucially, it gives people easier access to the final reports from projects that we funded over the last number of years. So again, if you go onto our department's YouTube channel, you'll find a video there to help you navigate your way around the dashboard, and I hope everyone finds that useful. So everybody, thanks very much for tuning in. I hope to see you all again tomorrow's webinar, and thanks again to the speakers. Bye-bye.